Down. Stuart, good morning. How are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. We've, as is traditional, we've had another good week, and we've just had a discussion on diversity, which was a little bit out of the norm in some ways. I think we got a bit deeper into some issues. I think that group now is more familiar with each other, so there's a greater element of trust and understanding. So we're able to dive into that. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about the upcoming AI session, which is on the 6th of August. And I know you are looking forward to that one especially. That was the last conversation we had was the first on that subject, and it was really good. And we've got some topics to get into. But first, the ED&I. The sort of premise for this conversation was really, does ED&I need to be rebranded? And then we talked a little bit about AI generated biases and that sort of thing at the end. But we were discussing the possibility of rebranding ED&I because of some of the negativity that we've seen over the last few months about the subject. I've got some thoughts on it. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think the general group that we have, obviously, they're professionals in the ED&I world, and therefore, understandably, they're very protective over what they do and how they do it, and they don't see any reason to change it, and therefore they think they should stay with it, right, for now, for sure, right. I think there is a little bit of understanding that there has been some negative commentary, typically around where some of this has gone wrong, hasn't been done right, and there's various case studies around the world that sort of demonstrate some of this stuff, and then it creates a lot of noise, doesn't it, around some of those things, and therefore there are some groups, especially I guess in the US at the moment, are looking to move away from the term to sort of move more with the sort of the popularity, and how this stuff evolves generally anyway, right? But I'm sort of with the guys that we talked to earlier that it is what it is, right? I mean, they're trying to do all the right things for all the right reasons, and therefore, stay.
Yeah,
with
I
it.
agree. I think the success in some ways is causing some of the reaction to it, and we've seen that over the years to many different things: customer experience, employee experience, a lot of these things. And some of the guys are absolutely right. You get some of that pushback against it as it becomes successful. I think we got into some deeper issues as well, and I think I really liked we came quite quickly to the difference between the perception of and the reality. So the perception of ED&I and the reality of engaging with it. And I think that's what you're saying. That we had the pleasure of having quite a few experienced practitioners on the call, in the discussion, and that's very different to the perception that the subject can generate. And I think that was a theme going through our discussions. And the perception is driven a lot by social media, about things we see on the news, some of the bigger stories, but also it's driven by lazy thinking, people for different reasons feeling left out or resenting other groups of people. So in some cases, even make things up. But that perception is, I think, is why we came to this conversation about rebranding, because the perception is, from a lot of people, quite difficult now. We got into talking about woke and things like that, and how we wish we could just dump those expressions because they've come to mean something that they don't represent. I just wonder if ED&I has become the same way, especially diversity and inclusion has come to represent something that doesn't really mean. That is, certainly when we talk to these people, they're going about it in the right way. They're trying to share knowledge. They're trying to share understanding, so that we can all get along and work together and bring different diverse thoughts into the workplace. So that it's going, it's a lot of right people doing the right thing. I just wonder if the brand, still the perception of it is going in the wrong direction.
But I think as often is the case, especially in social media, it tends to be a very minority view by a few loud people that they think they have a representation of a greater voice when often they don't, right? But they feel they have the authority to speak out, and actually freedom of speech. They can speak out, but it tends to be a small minority that creates a lot of noise. Versus, and I think this is absolutely true for the ED&I type environment, the actions, the things that they're doing, 99% of which is wholly brilliant, right? Everyone makes mistakes. Sometimes things go wrong. There are some clear examples where things have gone wrong, but it's the minority. Yet then over the indexes in terms of the noise it creates against the majority of really good things, right? So you got to. I think you got to put this in perception, but you got to put it in perspective. How much of this is just noise around the edges for what is doing general things? I mean, one of the conversations we had in the meeting was, whichever way you play this, whatever was the majority group may well feel threatened by this, just in whatever level that threat takes, because the ED&I function is creating much greater fairness and equality, and therefore giving a greater voice to the minority groups, whatever the minority groups are, whether it's gender, religion, whatever it might be, it doesn't matter. But they're giving them a greater voice. So whatever the majority group is, will feel not necessarily left out, although there are some examples where they feel left out, but they feel threatened by it because they're losing, I guess, some of their natural privilege, their natural bias, right? But the whole point of this is, yes, they are going to be losing some of their natural privilege and bias. That's the whole point, right?
So it's interesting because I've thought about it since the conversation, and I thought it was a really thought-provoking conversation. So from that perspective, it was great. When you're talking about the majority losing some of their power, I think it was said on the call. What we've got to bear in mind with that majority is that that wasn't the individual. So in some way, perhaps individuals now are being punished for other people in their demographic and the actions they took previously, if you see what I mean, which is then quite difficult. But as you play that back, then some of the minorities are getting privileges because of the actions taken by that minority in the past. So you've got this time element to it as well, which is interesting. And that's perhaps why, again, some people are being threatened and think, well, they're not doing this, but people in that demographic have done it in the past. So it's a really difficult area. And we got into a conversation around conflict, which I also thought was quite interesting because I think the Gartner article put conflict management in the same space as ED&I. And that was sort of hinting at that ED&I does cause some conflict. And inevitably, it's going to. And I think there's nothing wrong with ED&I being assertive when it needs to be. But some of it, as people on the call recognised, has gone too far. So some of the minorities and individuals within minorities have gone across the Rubicon, as it were, and gone into aggressive behaviour that's not helping. So it's a fascinating area.
It's also a bit of a dichotomy, isn't it? And this is the conversation we're having. Conflict is a very negative word. Has very negative connotations, doesn't it? And no one likes the word conflict. Conflict resolution, conflicting opinions, less so. And conflict resolution is definitely part of what the ED&I function is definitely trying to do. It's trying to resolve I guess the lack of respect of difference, right? I think when we got on to talking much more around, and the dichotomy, by the way, is, from an ED&I perspective, of course, you're trying to create diverse thinking. You're trying to create difference in thinking. You're almost stimulating the fact that you've got conflicting opinions, because you want people to be able to feel able to share conflicting opinions. Clearly, ultimately, people need to get together, agree the right strategy, path of actions, and unite and follow something through to execution. But you absolutely want a healthy environment where people feel free to state different viewpoints and opinions, right? So and an EDI is absolutely trying to stimulate that. So on one hand, the EDI is trying to stimulate differences of opinions, which some people might say conflict, and on the other hand, they're there to try to resolve conflict, to bring people respectfully together around those different thoughts, right? So it's a really interesting environment.
It's interesting, and it's got to be one of the toughest asks. It's just occurred to me, this has got to be one of the toughest asks for any change within organisations, because you're absolutely right. We're trying to get difference of opinion, but we don't want to call it conflict, because we don't want conflicts. But we've got to acknowledge that there are some different opinions, and some of those are really deeply held opinions around gender and all sorts of things. And it's great to come to a different place where everyone can be accepted and be who they want to be. Fantastic. But the journey there is going to be difficult. I can't see how it can't be, really. Going back to where we said before, when you talk to the participants, the practitioners in this space, everyone should be able to get there, right? They're very good at taking people on that journey, and they're respectful of themselves. But it's the wider audience that's so difficult, and that's why I think we've seen in the past diversity training that has caused a lot of conflicts and a lot of distrust, because it hasn't been done well enough. So in a way, this is a one-to-one conversation in so many areas. And both of us coach, and we know how important conflict resolution is, and how important it is to help people see other people's point of view. And people have a different a version of the reality, and that's perfectly acceptable place to be. People will view something differently, and the whole thing about the human race, and when things work well, is you understand what somebody else has seen, and that you've seen it differently, you've seen it through a different frame. Bring those things together, so you sort of decide a way forward. As we know, can take quite a lot of time and effort, and a lot of thinking to get there. So ED&I has got an awful lot to do. It's endlessly fascinating. I love getting involved in the conversations with people. I can't wait to see where it goes over the next few years. We also touched on AI generated biases, and it was interesting that certainly the people we had represented at that group sort of were aware of it, but hadn't really got into it yet. But I think both of us and lots of people see that AI has the possibility of being very poor at not replicating biases. It can really put biases on steroids, can't it?
Yeah, I think the issue is typically, a lot of AI models are fueled by data that is inherently biased. So if your initial data set that you're training your models on has bias within it, then guess what? The model that you're going to create will have inherent bias too, right? So and again, there's ways out of this. There's ways of actually then making sure that the data that you train your models on is unbiased to start with. Is much more holistic in its nature, not just as initial training set, but actually then also the ongoing verification. And then likewise, you can test for bias. You can look at various ways of actually validating whether your model has bias in it by your testing regime, right? So there's lots of things you can do to try and address this, but actually, do all companies do this? Probably not. Do they use biased data in the first place to train them? In some instances, absolutely they will do, right? And actually, they may not even necessarily be consciously aware of the bias that's inherent in their models.
correct me, Stuart, and you know much more about this stuff than I do. If you're collecting data from a biased world, right, historical data that was biased, how do you unbias it? I'm just talking about how many, representation of women in different roles, the different educational backgrounds, the different social backgrounds, all that bias is in the data. How do you extract it? Because you can't put more women in position because they weren't there, and I don't know how does that work.
Yeah, I mean, it's about there's different ways of doing it statistically or otherwise. I mean, you can proportionalize your data to make sure it's much more representative of a statistically norm distribution rather than some sort of bias distribution. There's lots of mathematical ways of doing that, as well as actually just physically sifting data in the first place to what you train your models on, right? I mean, and then again, it's about how you validate your models. So you need to make sure you're testing after you've created the models on an ongoing basis, the regime that continues on, to ensure that as your models continually learn, it's learning from the populace that you're trying to generate a response to, and not just a narrow proportion of the populace, because again you'll be generating changes in your model that will go in a certain direction that may not be holistic or healthy to the outcomes you're trying to achieve.
This would mean that ED&I needs to be involved in this now. It needs to be a participant now as these models are being put together, as the data is being amassed, and etc. It's a now conversation. It's not one down the road. My simple understanding, if we don't do that work now, then the biases are going to be there forever and a day, and it's going to be very difficult to re-engineer it.
Yeah, obviously it depends on what the business case is and what you're trying to create an AI, a solution for, obviously, because but regardless of what it is, it may not be some sort of humanistic bias. The AI may be there to sample some sort of system outage stuff. It could be anything, right? But again, if you're training on a very narrow field of system outage data, then it's only going to learn those things and think everything looks like that, rather than the things that look like that. Bias is inherent based off the data set you train your models on, right? So unless you've got really holistic data when you're trying to get a holistic solution, then you're not going to get a holistic solution.
So I think the next group session we have on diversity and inclusion, if anyone listening wants to join us, frb.buzz, go on there and you can contact us, or you can contact us through LinkedIn. We'd love to have your views on it. Next time round, I think we're going to be talking a little bit more about those biases, but we can talk about behaviours as well that came into this conversation, and we might go sort of the other end of the scale and talk about behaviours and how we go about changing behaviours. And I wonder how the diverse opinion will come into that as well, because we don't want to be seen to be ED&I establishing the set of behaviours it wants. It needs to be behaviours that are better, which will be interesting. So we'll have that next discussion. That'll be on the Tuesday next month. So that's great. I'm looking forward to that. So now the next session on AI will be the 6th of August. We're having a holiday next week, but the 6th of August. Looking forward to that discussion, and this sort of leads on from where we are. So we're looking at data governance, and we're looking at ethics, and we're looking at morality. In some ways, those two things are connected. In others, they're not. What are your thoughts on ethics and the morality surrounding AIs to start with? Let's pick on one of those. Let's think about morality. What's your opening thoughts on morality?
Well, I think they're massive topics, aren't they? I mean, as often is the case, technology accelerates faster than the regulatory legislative regime that comes against it, and because of that and that alone, you have to do the right thing morally and ethically, don't you? In terms of what you're actually doing. Like, if the legal framework isn't there, you're going to have to do what's right. I mean, and this is ultimately about taking responsibility, isn't it? It's you can't, and actually that's what FRB is all about, right? Fellowship for Responsible Business, and none more so is in creating any type of AI solution. You have to be really thinking about what is the solution, who's the benefit of the solutions, how do you create that solution, how do you ensure that solution is sustained and maintained as a quality of solution, and it's then therefore done for the right reasons in a responsible way. You can't blame the computer if it gets something wrong, because it's trained, managed, governed, programmed by human beings, right? You have to take total responsibility for ensuring that the outcomes of the solution that you're generating are as accurate as you can get them. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. These things aren't perfect, by the way. They never are, never will be. But if they're better than a human being making the same decisions in whatever guise, whether that's the quality of the decision, the speed of the decisions, there's lots of reasons for doing this sort of stuff, then it's better than a human. As long as you can verify and validate it's better than a human, then you're better off employing an AI solution to do it responsibly than employing a person.
So there you go. You've wandered straight into I guarantee the number one topic that's going to come in here. Okay, and it is interesting. We in our last discussion we touched briefly on safety issues and that sort of stuff, and you get to the point of who's responsible, and you need a person responsible. But it's no good having a person responsible if they're not as good as the computer, they're not as good as the software. So you quickly get into the morality discussions are very, very complex. If you try and get a too simple a moral guide, it breaks down very quickly. Anyone that listens to Radio 4's Moral Maze will see that. I remember I talked about one a while ago about the morality of having unmanned military vehicles and aircraft, and it was really interesting because you thought, no, that's not right. You need a human being pushing the button, so you need a human being in the plane. But then you get the human being in the plane who's being shot at, who gets a rush of blood to his head because he's being shot at, so he fires back. Where someone in a control room's he's not being fired at directly, so he can make a more clinical, deliberate decision on what he's going to do, and you get better outcomes. So I think we'll get into all of that stuff. I'm sure, probably not fighter jets, but we'll get into those issues about morality, and the morality of work is another interesting thing. Should we be favouring people instead of machines because that's the moral thing to do to keep people employed? Now, I'm sure
I don't see it that way. Yeah, I think the landscape for roles will continue to evolve as they have done over the last thousands of years. They will for the next thousands of years, right? There will not be a shortage of work, right? But the nature of work may change, and hopefully change for the better, for the planet and for the human race, right? And so I don't see those as a juxtapose at all. We should be fully endorsing and putting our arms around advancement in technology to better things, right? And it does mean that we might need to retrain, us included, to take on board some of this technology and work with it. But that means our roles and what we do may evolve. But I don't think things, some roles may completely disappear, but there'll be new roles. That are created.
I totally agree with you, Stuart. If we had that attitude, then we'd still have people working in mills and working underground, more digging coal when machines can do it, etc., etc., etc. But we still will get that reaction of people, and it's still a little bit about trust and the ethics of it. What about data governance? Now, for people not involved directly, data governance seems like a very dry subject. What's your thoughts on data governance?
Well, it's incredibly important, especially AI, but actually generally anyway, right? But AI, brings this to a forefront in reality. Unless you've got good quality data going into your into your models, you'll get what you get, right? I mean, it's pretty straightforward, and actually, therefore, your organization's capability to make sure that your data is incredibly well governed and managed to ensure that it's wholesome and it's accurate and it's maintained at that degree of accuracy with the right ownership, the right processing, etc., etc., is absolutely implicitly important, right? And else you're going to get yourself into a right mess, right? AI is just going to highlight that. So data, in today's technology world, is the new oil. It is absolutely what businesses will thrive on. It is thriving on them today, right? We are incredibly digitally biased these days, computers to computer data in whatever field, whatever it is, whether you're talking medicine, whether you're talking about finance, doesn't matter. It's data, and actually, if your data practices are not up to date and ensuring the quality and integrity of your data to drive the decision making and processing and outcomes that you're looking for, you are going to be.
I totally agree with you, and I heard an interview from a CEO of a bank earlier this week, and he was asked about the most important things for getting a business running properly, and he said, "I always would have said people, but now I'm not sure if I should say people or data." And it's that, and I'm sure you're the same because you're about people. You've always been about people, but they're becoming the two things you've got to get right. You've got to get the right people, to get the right data, and it's that important now. You can almost not forget everything else, but the two things spring from there. And I would say you've got to get the right diversity of people. You've got to get the right thinking, and then you've got to get the right data, and you've got to get the right diversity of data as well. Once you've got that, then a business is going to run. But how many companies do we know and businesses do we know that are running on very poor data and very poor people management strategies? So it's a real challenge where we're going in the future, I think, to try and get those things. And again, they could be, you could see them as opposed, but they're not really. They're the data's empowering the people are empowering the data. It's those two pillars. Now, companies like their 4 or 5 pillars, well, you probably have finance in there as well, but really it's data and people. So
Absolutely,
looking forward to that discussion. Then we're going to go on to have a more discussion on the future of work, and it's endlessly fascinating how these subjects are blurring into each other. So we've done AI when we're talking about diversity. When we're talking about AI, we'll be talking about diversity. When we're talking about future of work, we're talking about both those subjects. So it's amazing to me how we're getting really now, having done this for quite a few months now, or a couple of years almost, how we're getting to understand the interaction between all these things and how those interactions are crucial to running a responsible business. So I'm really encouraged by the whole thing. I think it's fantastic. So thank you for that, Stuart. Anything else you want to add? Sorry, I've been talking. Anything else you wanted to add in on that?
No, it's going to be a great
Excellent.
conversation.
Okay, I'll speak to you then.